All right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our live event with David Joy, the author of the new novel, When These Mountains Burn. I'm Lane Jacobson, the owner of Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon. And before we get into things, just a few housekeeping and tech reminders. This event is brought to you by Books in Common Northwest, an event series that we put together alongside with Madison Books in Seattle and Country Bookshelf in Bozeman. The event is being recorded, and after the event, you can view the recording by going to booksincommonnw.com or visiting the Books in Common Northwest YouTube channel. There is a link to buy your copies of David's books in the chat, and we'll be dropping that link back into the chat throughout the event. If you have any questions for the author, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them as time allows. You can also see the questions that other folks have asked and vote on which of those questions you'd most like to hear the answer to. And you can leave comments in the chat window to the right. If you run into any tech issues along the way, we recommend you try exiting and re-entering the webinar. If you can't get back in, you can visit the Books in Common Northwest YouTube channel where the event is being streamed live. And plugging headphones in usually fixes any sound issues. We would also like to remind everyone that this is a shared creative space, and we ask that we all be respectful of everyone else who has joined us tonight. Any offensive comments and questions will see the user dismissed from the event. We also wanted to thank everyone who has joined us throughout this whole event series over the last several months. We will be back in 2021 with more virtual events. But in the meantime, we've got one more event for you this calendar year, and that's with podcaster, television host, and author Stephen Ranella, who will be presenting his new book, The Meat Eater Guide to Wilderness Skills and Survival. That's going to be on Tuesday, December 2nd at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time. And now with all of that out of the way, it's my great pleasure to introduce our author for the evening. David Joy is the author of The Line That Held Us, The Weight of This World, and Where All Light Tends to Go. His stories and creative nonfiction have appeared in a number of publications, and he is the author of the memoir Growing Gills, A Fly Fisherman's Journey, and a co-editor of Gather at the River, 25 Authors on Fishing. Joy lives in the Western North Carolina mountains. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me,
albeit
virtually.
Yes, definitely. We kind of joked about it a little earlier, but it is at least less of a time commitment than us flying you out here for the book festival like we did last year.
Yeah, but I don't get to see mule deer and the Merriam's turkeys that you had.
You didn't get to blast a turkey like you wanted to, but they'll be here. So I wanted to congratulate you on publication of another really fantastic book that also got like rave reviews and everything. And if you don't mind, if you've got something to read for us or just introduce us to the book, I'll pass it off to you.
Yeah, well, I think I told you I'm no good at an elevator pitch, but when I think about the themes of this novel, there's really two overriding themes. One of those is the opioid epidemic that is really taking hold here right now. We had problems with prescription drugs, over the past decade or so, but heroin has really started to strangle this place as of the last 2 or 3 years. And so one of those themes in this book, it's largely about the opioid epidemic. It's about a father who's got a son that's an addict. And then it's about there's another character named Denny Rattler who's suffering from addiction. But then the other theme is that this book is largely about the death of a culture. And I've said this a lot through the years, and this is kind of in the background of all my novels, but I think we're within one generation of the old school mountain people and mountain ways disappearing. It's just it won't be here another 20 years. It might not be here another 10. And so that's an overriding theme of this book, and maybe well, definitely more so than any of my others. And so I thought I'd read a little bit from one of the main characters, Raymond Mathis, where he's kind of thinking about these things. but he's sitting out on a porch drinking whiskey, uh, as I wish I was doing right now. It says a coyote began to howl directly behind the house. The animal was close, maybe 75 yards up the ridge, so that Raymond could almost feel the sound resonating against the back of his neck. Across the holler, the howl was answered by another, then another, a series of calls strung together by intervals of distance so that it seemed that what started at a singular point might stretch on in every direction the entire world over. The calls quickened into a high-pitched symphony, an eerie and beautiful wave of dissonance as if God were running his hands over a theremin. Raymond closed his eyes and let the sound come through him, bury itself someplace deep that for a long time nothing else had been able to touch. All of a sudden, the great conductor flattened his hands and the woods fell silent. Ray waited and listened, but as quickly as it had come, it had vanished, and that was the way of the world. His mind turned instantly back to what had been troubling him over the past week. He was grieving the loss of a place and a people. It was hard enough to bury the bodies of those you loved, but it was another sadness altogether to witness the death of a culture. There was the gone and the going away, and there was the after. He found it difficult to imagine what would become of this place, harder still to witness what it was already becoming. For years, he'd been trying to put his finger on the moment things started to fall apart. As silly as it sounded, sometimes he blamed it on the arrival of television. When people could see what folks had on the outside, they started to want those things for themselves. They heard the way people spoke off the mountain and slowly began to change the way they talked. Things that seemed trivial and harmless at the time, looking back, had signified a beginning. But even before that, before the outside began to press in, the communities were breaking apart and the people were leaving. When the timber was gone and the mountains were left as naked as the moon, families packed up and headed west to places like Oregon and Washington, where the trees had yet to be touched. Jump forward 60 years, and it was the same old story when the paper mills shut down, when the old plastics plant at the south end of the county left, when Daco laid off everybody in Waynesville, or when Acosta disappeared from Brevard. The jobs came on slick-tongued promises from outsiders, driving fancy cars and dressed in fancy suits, and left again folded in their ostrich skin wallets when everything that could be taken was took. The people ran desperately behind them, waving their hands through the dust and exhaust, dusty and exhausted, out of breath, beaten and broken. And when they finally keeled over and stopped, they looked around to realize they were standing in places unfamiliar, that they were lost as turned around dogs. Those who stayed raised their children to do better. They told them to go to college. They told them to get an education so that they could find a good job, one that didn't leave their hands calloused, their skin cracked, their bones broken and mended. We don't want you to have to work like we did. That was what they said, and it was a noble thought with an ominous end. Instead of remaining rooted to the place that carried their name, they took their names with them when they left. The very fabric that once defined the mountains fragmented and was replaced with outsiders who built second and third homes on the ridge line and drove the property values so high that what few locals were left couldn't afford to pay the taxes on their land. Of course, there were the drugs. There was the decade of meth, the transition to pain pills and needles, and that wasn't a mountain problem so much as an American problem. That was the escapist cure for systemic poverty, the result of putting profit margins ahead of people for 200 years. And when it all boiled down, that was the root cause of it all. It wasn't just a matter of economics. It wasn't the drugs. It was an abandonment of values. It was trading hard work for convenience. It was marking the nearest Starbucks as a place more important than the front porch. Ray remembered the old days. He remembered being a kid and how when Dottie Dills needed a new roof, the community got together and built it themselves over the course of a weekend with smiles on their faces, food in their bellies, and laughter hung in their throats. They did it for no other reason than that they were neighbors and it was something that needed done. Nowadays, people didn't even know their neighbors' names, and what was worse was that they didn't want to. They sold off their heritage and bought it back in the form of bumper stickers. They strutted around in t-shirts with mason jars on the front, wearing the words Southern Charm with a disillusioned pride, wholeheartedly believing that those two words and that single image somehow represented where they came from. They'd all run off and left themselves. They'd run off and left the very best parts of themselves. Now everyone was sitting around watching the last of it flicker like a sunset with eyes blind and minds dumb to the fact that when the night finally came, there would come no light again. The very nature of things demanded that there would come a moment in history when hopefulness would equate to naivety, when the situation would have become too dire for saving. Raymond knew this, and it was that final thought that had left his heart in ruins. That's about it.
Yeah, and so I'm really glad that you picked that bit to read, because it relates to a question that I had, and I want to dive kind of into that idea more, a little bit of the kind of death knell of a culture. And this book, more obviously Southern lit, it's kind of a standard thing that it's very firmly rooted in place, which is something that I'm sure we'll get to. But this book, more than I think your others, at least for me, also seemed to be rooted in time.
Yeah.
So you have the fires in the background from, I think, the 2016 season.
Yeah.
And then you also have which is just only kind of referenced, but the election happening in the background. And there's some subtle and then not so subtle, where that character Ray says the country wasn't a month out from the election and Ray already wanted to huck himself off the side of Mount Rushmore.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the decision to set it at that particular time, if it was deliberate or if it just felt right, or more about that.
Yeah, it was absolutely deliberate, and it was I had multiple characters who were experiencing the end of something, and so with Raymond, he was experiencing loss. He's basically the last person of this long lineage of people left in this place. He's experiencing the loss of family. He's experiencing the loss of culture. He feels like he's witnessing the end of the world. And then I have a Cherokee character named Denny Rattler who's suffering from heroin addiction, and I think it's the same thing for him. He feels left behind. There's all of these good things happen around him, and he's just sinking further and further into his own addictions. And so I think for both these characters, they felt like they were witnessing the end of the world. And if I were going to pick a time period when that would make sense, it would be 2016. And wildfires we're not the West, so wildfires are very uncommon here. I mean, we live in a rainforest. It's very uncommon for us to have those types of fires. And so in 2016, we basically didn't get any rain. And so those fires started in September, and they burned all the way basically into December. And a lot of people around the nation are familiar with when Gatlinburg burned. I think that, made some national news. But the truth is those fires had been going for months. There were fires all the way from Alabama, on up to through Kentucky and West Virginia, all along the Appalachian chain. And so you had these fires where, you couldn't walk outside and the sky was just yellow with it. It was hard to breathe. And we were also experiencing what at the time was one of the most divided and confusing presidential elections in American history, which looking back from a 2020 perspective, it's maybe even laughable. But when I tried to think about setting those stories against a time period that would make sense, that just felt like the right place to do it.
Definitely. And so, like I said, really is kind of like a borderline, I guess I would say, tired question about, place being with Southern literature. But hopefully I can kind of come at this from a slightly different angle. So there's a bit towards the end of the book where he's thinking to himself about leaving this place. And it was hard for him to wrap his head around the meaninglessness of it all. But every time he crossed that line, he got anxious. The boundary was a blessing and a curse, a place where he felt at once safe and trapped, but he knew he could not stay there anymore. And I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about that, how place, particularly in Southern lit, when it relates to poverty, can serve both as safety for characters, but also as something that traps characters.
Yeah, well, I think that's the rural reality. I mean, you could go to some small town in Kansas and talk to a 16-year-old kid and ask him what was going on in his mind, and he would say, "I just want to get the hell out of this place." Same thing as some kid in Montana, same thing in Alabama. I think that's a rural reality. We always want to just get out, and for a lot of people, especially where I live, they don't have the economic mobility and the privilege to make that a reality. College might not be an option for them. And sometimes it can be as simple as just that first generation gap. It can be as simple as filling out the paperwork, nobody in the household knowing, nobody encouraging them to go, not knowing where the tuition's going to come from. So the idea of leaving, I think is a far-fetched idea for a lot of kids. We still get a lot of people who, and this is more so a male reality than I think a female reality. But in this place, we still get a lot of kids who just go into their father's line of work, whatever that may be, working construction or working for the DOT or they just kind of follow those paternal lineages. And so I think that idea of being trapped is very real. And at the same time, you feel a love for this place and an understanding of this place that most people will they'll never experience because they never come to know a place the way that you do here. The difference for Denny is I think that would be times 1,000, in that he's an enrolled member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indian. He grew up on the Koala boundary, which if people aren't familiar to the Koala boundary, you can think reservation, although technically Cherokee here isn't a reservation. That land is held in trust. They own that land. But so I think for him, it's an even smaller place. It's literally Cherokee. It's literally being surrounded by family, and it's tenfold. But yeah, I think that's a reality that isn't just Southern or isn't just Appalachian. It's just it's growing up in small places. Where everybody and everybody knows you, and there ain't no easy way out.
Yeah, there's a bit in the book where he goes just one county over to Jackson County, and he doesn't know, he knows like where the Walmart is, and that's it. And that struck me because normally, the characters know the area like the back of their hand, and for him to be so lost while still being so close to home was striking to me. And you kind of touched on this a little bit, and I think it does relate more to the rural rather than the Southern. Do you have kind of thoughts or feelings on the almost like genreification of the Southern noir and the kind of gritlit thing. Do you think that the South inherently lends itself to that, or is it just something that's kind of been, plastered on it?
Oh, I I don't have any reservations about that classification, and I think one of the reasons I can think of a writer like Daniel Woodrell who really distanced himself eventually from that term noir and rural noir, and I can understand because it's placing him in the context of a different type of noir, film noir. But when I think about that term, I think about the French. I think about just that idea of black, just that idea of a piece of art carrying a mood. And my books are very much that. Um, you can tell from the opening lines of my books what you're in for. I mean, I think about a book like The Weight of This World, and the opening line was Aiden McCall was 12 years old the one time he heard I love you. If you can read that sentence and think that it's going to be the feel-good book of the year, then I don't know. I ain't going to be able to help you. But yeah, those terms don't bother me, and I think it does a good job of placing my work in the context of the writers who I'm rooted in and whose shoulders I'm standing on. Whether that be Larry Brown, William Gay, Ron Rash, even somebody like Bonnie Jo Campbell, Dorothy Allison. But I think there is something about the South that lends itself to violence, even to a violent story. And I said one time, I said this in a reading at Malaprops, and I mean people gasped, but I basically told them that I thought it was Christianity. The most violent book I ever read was the Bible, and I think whenever most people in the South grew up going to church uh, at least one day a week, if not like me, Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, 3 days a week. And you grow up surrounded by these very violent stories, uh, whether that be, God asking somebody to cut their baby in half or, or sacrifice their son. I mean, or the story of the Levite and the concubine, something like that. I mean, those are the most violent stories I ever read, and I think it all boils down to what Flannery O'Connor said when she was asked if the South were Christ centered, and she said, "I don't know if the South is Christ centered, but it is most certainly Christ haunted." And I think that's absolutely right. I think that connection between violence and story is something that's very much rooted in our culture and where we come from.
Can you talk a little bit more about your incorporation of violence in the books? Because they some of the books more than others, but they certainly
Yeah.
are violent and very, I think, honest in their depictions of violence.
Yeah.
But also not gratuitous either. And
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about striking that balance and why you include the violence?
Yeah. Well, I think it's been different for every book. And you know, the most violent book obviously is The Weight of This World. That book is incredibly violent. And with that book, I was really interested in trying to see where I wanted readers to draw lines. Like I've had people tell me I had to put the book down, and I told them, good. I said, you get it. I wanted to know when you put the book down, and I wanted to know when you cheered it on, when you cheered that violence on. And the reason I wanted to do that with that book specifically was I became really interested with uh, how we put we push violence away so much as this horrible thing, uh, which it is, and then you have this atrocity, atrocious event take place, whether that be, let's say Stephen Paddock in, climbing up in that hotel in Las Vegas, or let's say Omar Mateen in that, walking into that gay nightclub in Miami, or that was Orlando, and shooting that place up. And you ask somebody, well, what should happen with them? And I mean, we would become a mob, and we want to kill them. And that line is interesting to me, like uh, where we push ourselves away from violence and don't want anything to do with it, and where we cheer it on. And so I wanted that book to play with that. Um, I also think that I think violence. I think a book has to carry tension, and I think that's an easy way to do it sometimes. Um, I tried to I try to make it palatable. If it, that yeah, that's the word. Because I think about William Gay, and William Gay wrote a lot of really violent stories. I think about that story, The Paper Hanger, one of the most violent stories I've ever read. I mean, at one point, this man kills basically a toddler, uh, and at one point he has this toddler in an ice box in a freezer, and the sentences are some of the most beautiful language I've ever read in my life.
I think
And
with the
yeah,
like
the snowflakes and the eyelashes,
yeah.
for instance. And he describes the ice crystals coming off that child's skin as rosettes. Like it's this gorgeous language. And at the time I was struck by it. And then what I realized that he did was he enabled the reader to get through something that wouldn't have been possible otherwise by upping the language. And that became something that I've really tried to do a whole lot of times. Again, especially with the weight of this world, I have a hard time, talking about the idea of violence and not talking about that book, because that's the theme of that book. It is violence and how we get to that place. Uh, there's a moment in that book where one of the characters uh, just he says that he thinks it's the act of not listening to one another anymore that has made the world so volatile, and I think that's right. uh, I think nobody feels heard anymore. uh, but yeah, I think that all goes into it. And at the same time, if you're writing about this country and you're not writing about violence, you're not writing about reality. I mean, this is probably, you know this is one of the most violent places in the world. Uh, no other place in the world has the number of mass shootings, or school shootings, or shootings in general, as we do. It's unheard of. And so I think, to be a novelist in America, if you're not writing about misogyny, if you're not writing about racism, if you're not writing about xenophobia, if you're not writing about violence, you're not paying attention.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about your writing process? Your books are pretty tightly plotted. I remember, I think the first time I saw you speak at Flyleaf for your first book, somebody asked what your preferred way for them to read the book would be, and you said in a single sitting. But along with that tight plotting, you've also got some pretty remarkable, characters with a lot of depth, and then also the language is really beautiful. So where does all that begin for you? Do you start with a character or a story or a sentence?
I think things tend to start. They either start with just some of the novels have started with images. Some of the past two novels have started with just a tiny element of truth, and so the line that held us, for instance, um, that novel starts with a hunter accidentally shooting a man who he mistook for a hog. That really happened in the county over, and a game warden was telling me this story. And so you can take something like that and then just turn it on its head and crank up the volume and see what happens. And with this novel, it was similar in that I knew a man. I knew a man whose son was a really bad methamphetamine addict, and he ran up this giant debt. Um, and his father told me that he rode up the mountain with $10,000 in cash and a shotgun in his lap to buy his son's life back. Uh, and I always wanted to use that to try and see what I could make out of it. And so that's how this novel starts. Is this father getting a call that they're going to kill his son if he doesn't pay this money? And so the past two novels have started, with something like that, with just this tiny bit of a story, and then just starting with that and following it blindly. The thing that has always happened, though, and that continues to happen now, is that uh, I'll have characters, and sometimes I could see them with those early novels, especially. I could see those characters like in an image, and then it was a matter of trying to figure out who they are, how they get there, where are they going, um, and that takes place over really long periods of time. I'm thinking about this novel that I'm working on. Those earliest characters, it was probably, I don't know, 2.5, 3 years ago. And you just slowly start to learn more and more things about them. And the way that I've explained it in the past is that a character doesn't have to go to the Waffle House in the book. Uh, but if they did go to a Waffle House, I know how they'd order their hash browns. You need to know the character intimately. I've said if you imagine your mother or father, and they're in line at a grocery store, and say somebody cuts line, or say somebody says something rude to his wife, or does this or that. Just imagine this situation, and then I say, well, what would your mama had said, or what would your mama had thought? And it'll come to you like that, because you know them. You know everything about them, and so I want to get to know characters like that. And until I know them that intimately, I really can't move forward. But but once I do, everything really comes quickly, because I can dump them into this aquarium of a situation, and I know how they're going to react. I know what they're going to say, and then it's just a matter of turning them loose and watching what they do.
Do you, when you're writing, do you find that knowing the characters so well, do you write, I guess, how robust is your editing process? Do you write something 3 times as long as what ends up being the finished product, and then you trim away all this stuff? Or is it more like just revision of something that's always kind of this length?
Uh, yeah, for me, I edit as I go. I can't sleep until it reads well. And so a lot of times I've tended to write about a chapter a day when I'm really cooking. And once I get it out, then I'm playing with language. Uh, the sentences tend to be pretty close from the beginning. My main revisions happen not on a sentence level, uh, but with my editor, who she has a much better understanding of big ideas than I can. I can't see the forest for the trees, kind of thing. And so once she gets her hands on it, she can see a lot bigger things than I'm capable of seeing. And usually, when she gives me those notes, it'll take a couple months for me to really wrap my head around what she's saying. Uh, but I trust her wholeheartedly because she's never been wrong. Uh, and I say that as somebody who once gave her a novel and she told me it was shit. Uh, and I trashed it. And she was right. At the time, it broke my heart because I mean, I'd spent, a year and a half writing this book, but the book wasn't good. And the book that came out of it was good. And it took tossing it to the fire. And you go through some situations like that with an editor, and you come to trust them wholeheartedly. And she's about as there are very few people in this industry doing what Sarah Minnick is doing. Uh, those types of editors are the ones that you hear stories about. Those legendary editors, and I've just been very fortunate to work with her on all of the books that I've written.
Fantastic. What about your kind of literal process? I know you spend a lot of time out in the woods, out hunting, doing all that stuff. Do you have pen and paper with you to jot down ideas? Or are you just keeping it in your head?
I think I usually keep it in my head. Occasionally, especially if it's a piece of dialogue, I'll write that down, usually just in a note on my phone. Like if I opened my phone right now and looked at the notes, it would be a ton of just random pieces of dialogue. And sometimes none of that even makes it into a book. But again, it's that learning the characters, learning how they talk, learning what they would say. And so it all goes into the book, even though that specific line might not be there. But yeah, I spend a lot of times outdoors. And it seems like more and more. If I could, I'd stay there. Uh, I was in the woods deer hunting yesterday, and I spent all day today putting that deer up. I was cutting deer up before I left to drive down here. Um, and I feel a lot more, I feel a lot more comfortable and in place there than I do around people. This sounds bad, but I feel more and more detached from people and culture. I feel like Ray, and Ray was Ray was an old man, and I ain't but 36. I don't know. I don't know. I don't feel. Uh, I don't know. I feel more at place in the woods.
Yeah. I'm curious, through the last 8 months in the pandemic, has your day-to-day living in a rural area and spending most of your time out in the woods, has your day-to-day changed all that much?
No, not to be honest. We were at a rural people were at a real advantage when that first took off, because when you live an hour from the grocery store, you're used to buying shit for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
You've always got a month's worth of toilet paper. And also most of the people I know put up their own food. They've got gardens. They can. They hunt. They do all of these things, and so um, I mean, like right now, there's probably 120 pounds of meat in the freezer. And that's not including the vegetables that we put up. Uh, I could give a shit less if they told me I couldn't go anywhere for a month or 2 months.
Yeah.
And so we were at a tremendous advantage from that standpoint. And yeah, we never went out a whole lot anyways. Me and Ash, we miss going out to restaurants every occasionally. We'd go down to Asheville. We're foodies, so we'd go there and eat French food or something. Um, but I think really the place that it affected me the most was I had a whole lot of stuff going on in France. I was supposed to be going to Lyon right when all of it started. All of that got canceled. All of that fell apart. Um, Things eventually kind of worked themselves out, but still didn't go. And then I had this book come out in the middle of it. And unlike most authors, there were authors doing 40 events for books because they didn't have to leave their house. They could jump on these meetings all day. Well, I can't. I don't have that. I don't have internet at the house. I can't even get phone calls at the house. And so I had this book come out, and it felt like I couldn't do anything with it. And I think that hurt in that I think that this book has something incredibly valuable to say, uh, probably more so than any other book I've written. Um, I would stand the last chapter of this book up against anything that came out this year, period. Uh,
It's really good. That last chapter was is quite exceptional.
And I don't say that about stuff I write often, but I know how good that chapter is, and I want people to read that because I think it's important. I think what is said in that the closing of this book is important, and I think it has some really important questions, and it's a conversation we need to be having. And so to not be able to get around and do that, it's not like I ever had giant book tours, but hell, I always went to 10 or 15 bookstores and went around the country. And so to not be able to do that, to not be able to hang out with booksellers even, that's what I love. I don't enjoy the sitting in front of people and reading, but hell, I love going to bookstores and hanging out with booksellers and them passing me books, uh, you know. And so to not get to do that, that sucked.
Yeah, it's a shame. I remember, the first time that we met was when your first book came out and you were on tour, and I think there were 4 or 5 people in the audience, and we had a slow night. And when I sat in on the event, and I was just so impressed. And then when your second novel came out, the crowd was up to 25, and when your third novel came out, we had 80 people in the store, and we had to kick everybody out because they wanted to keep talking.
Yeah.
So something to look forward to in the after times, I guess.
Yeah.
So a couple questions from the audience. Which character was the most difficult for you to write? Was there one that just refused to be written the way you needed them to be?
With this novel, I think both of those main characters were difficult to write in that, I've written about a lot of addicts, and addiction is something that I understand well, in that I spent a lot of my life around addicts, and in a lot of ways, I was an addict myself for a long time. And so that's something I understand. What I didn't understand was the other side of that, being a father or being a mother, or just being somebody who loves an addict, who can't connect to those things, and at the same time is absolutely helpless, can't do anything for that person that they love. And so getting to that perspective was difficult for me. And so writing Raymond was difficult. But Denny Rattler, uh, at that point, I'm writing across race. Uh, I'm a white male writer. It doesn't get any more privileged than me. Uh, you know, and so to make the choice to write across race and to write a Native character, and to write a Cherokee character, you had to be willing to get it wrong. And if somebody tells me I get it wrong, I have to be willing to listen. Um, and it was important for me to try to do everything in my power to get that right. And so I think Denny was probably more difficult for me to write, um, just because of those things. Trying to there was such a risk of getting that wrong, and not just a risk, not just a personal risk, but the consequence of perpetuating a false narrative about a people that have had false narratives, uh, you know, spread for centuries. And so I think it was really important for me to try to get that right. And at the same time, I'm glad I did write that character, because that's the reality of this place. Jackson County, we butt up to the boundary. They literally have to leave the boundary to come to our Walmart, because there's not a Walmart in Cherokee. The dynamics of this place are strange, in that you have the Eastern Band here, button up to a county that's named after the man responsible for the Trail of Tears. Uh, and so you think about that conflict, um, and so you can't write about a place like this and ignore the presence of the people who have been here since people have been here.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you for saying all that. It's awesome to hear an author talk about that, and a white male author talk about that and acknowledge that. Another question from the audience related to characters. I wonder if there is a character from any of your books that you most resemble, or are any characters a reflection of you?
I would say elements of myself definitely find their ways, into things, as do elements of anybody else. I can think about just little tiny idiosyncrasies that you pull from people that you know. I always want to know what a character sings in the shower. Like, what's the song that comes on the radio that they sing loudly or they dance to? Because every person on this earth has one, and it goes back to wanting to know those characters intimately. But I would say Jacob McNeely in that very first novel, Where All Light Tends to Go. That character, very much me. One of the big things for him is that he refused to put his hope and faith in people anymore because he was sick of being disappointed. And that's very much me. I'm not a very hopeful or trusting person, and that's just because I've been burned one too many times. And so I think about a character like that. I think there was a lot of me in him. Yeah, that's probably it.
Let's see. Oh, I know I've heard you talk about this before. Blue has a question. It says, David, I'm having a tough time tracking down a copy of Growing Gills. Any plans for a reprint or updated anniversary edition in the future?
Probably not. There may still be a couple of copies available at my hometown, Indy, which is City Lights Bookstore in Sylva, North Carolina. And you can look them up. I think their website is citylightsnc.com. But if you look up City Lights Bookstore in Sylva, North Carolina, you can find it. And you can call them. The owner's name's Chris Wilcox. Ian's one of the booksellers. One of them will be there. Chris or Ian will be there. And you can ask if they have any copies. And if they do, they'll be happy to sell you one and mail it to you. As far as, that was a very small press. It was traditionally published, but it was a very small, regional press. And looking back, I wish it wasn't even on a bookshelf. And it's because I wrote that book when I was 25 years old. And I think the problem with especially memoir is that you only have the perspective of how far removed you are from it. And so as a 25-year-old, there were lots of things that I was really angry about, for instance, that looking back, I understand differently now. So for instance, a perfect example, and this has found its way into all my novels, is like just the destruction of this place through outsiders moving into this place and building second and third homes, $5 million houses on ridge lines, just destroying. That is our mountaintop removal in this part of Appalachia. And when I was younger, I'm an Ed Abbey nut. I always loved Edward Abbey and the Monkey Wrench Gang, and I just wanted to hayduke that. I wanted to hayduke that shit. I wanted to blow it up. And as a 36-year-old, I look at things a lot differently, and I look at the local people who are involved in that construction and development, and I realize that outside of that work, there's really no other way to put food on the table. So I'm less angry. I'm less jaded. And so, when I look at that book, there's a lot of things I wish I could change. And so I don't ever have any interest in trying to reprint it. Maybe if I croak off or something, they can
Do you,
somebody.
do you think you might write a like a follow-up memoir to it?
I don't know. I think that I will write a collection of essays at some point in time that will be sporting related. It might not all be fishing essays, but there'll be fishing and hunting essays. Like I think about, you know, what's the name of that essay collections? I can't think of the name of it now. Something Chance. Um, but anyways, there's this collection of sporting essays, and in it is one of the best. It's probably the best essay that was ever written on hunting. Um, you know, and I think about Tom McGuane is the writer who Thomas McGuane wrote something Chance, an off chance maybe. Um, and the name of the essay is something like Heart of the Game. But it's the best essay that's ever been written on hunting. I've got an essay I've been working on about 6 years that if I ever get it right, it'll be one of the best essays ever written on hunting. I don't have any question in my mind about that. I would love to put together a collection of sporting essays, um, and I say that in the way that good sporting literature is not about hunting or it's not about fishing. You think about a writer like John Giorak, who's probably big in Montana. Hell, he's probably big in Oregon. But all of those collections of essays he's written about fly fishing, they ain't a damn one of them about fly fishing. They're about everything else. And it's using sport as an avenue to get to human experience. And when that's done well, I love that. I still subscribe to Gray's Sporting Journal. I love that literature. I love a writer like Pete Fromm, who's
Yeah.
probably big out there. Well, he does that shit so well. Hell of a novelist and hell of a short story writer, but his sporting literature's incredible. I'd love to write one more book like that.
Cool. We had a couple people in the audience point out it's Tom McGuane and Outside Chance.
Yep.
I think it's one. So we've got time for, I think we'll try to squeeze in 2 more questions from the audience. And then I had 2 other questions of my own for you, but let's see. From the audience, what cultivated your love for writing? What personal experiences have shaped your method of storytelling and what you convey in your books?
Well, I come from an oral storytelling tradition, and so I grew up surrounded by storytellers, and I grew up in a time and a culture where children were to be seen but not heard, which is that you were supposed to be in the room and you were supposed to sit still and be quiet while the adults were talking, which at the time was nerve-wracking and made you want to pull your hair out. But looking back, what it taught you was how to listen. And so growing up, I was surrounded by story, and my grandmother was probably the best storyteller I've ever known. But aunts and uncles, or just being at church, at the end of church every Sunday, I'd wander around outside, and all the old men would be talking, all the old women would be talking, and I'd kind of find my way into them circles and listen. So I grew up surrounded by that. And I think I realized pretty early on that I was incapable of telling a story in the way that good orators are. So I can't tell a story like my grandmama could tell a story. But I realized pretty early too that I could write one, like very early. And so I wrote my whole life. By the time I got to college, I'd probably written 1,000 pages. None of it was any good. Probably wrote another 1,000 in college. None of that was any good. But I wasn't a quick study by any means. But I am stubborn and persistent. And so I just kept at it and kept at it. And I think eventually, something shifted, and I started to realize I was starting to be able to do something on a page that not a whole lot of people can. And so at that point, it really took off then. But all of my storytelling comes from that. It comes from that old oral storytelling tradition of just sitting around and listening to people talk.
And I had a question about gosh, I can't. What's the something Southerner journal?
The Bitter Southerner?
Yeah, Bitter Southerner. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think it was in there, and it may have been a couple years old, but in doing some research for this event, story about a teacher who invited you and I think Ron Rash to come and talk to her students.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and it being really a way for students who weren't finding any literature that resonated with them, they weren't clicking with it, a way for them to connect and see themselves. And I think that that's such a powerful example of, literature can be a thing that transports you and educates you about something else, but it can also be something in which you see yourself. And I was wondering if you could just talk about either that idea or the experience of going and talking to those students and connecting with them in that way, and what that was like.
Yeah, that teacher was named Mary Ann Leak, and she's who wrote that essay. She taught at Hayesville. She's retired since, but just, I mean, like if you ever wonder if some people are just put on this earth to do certain things, that's what she was put on this earth to do. I mean, she was a hell of a teacher. But I'll speak to both of those things. But for me, I didn't grow up in love with books, and it was because nobody ever handed me the right books. Like looking back, I can think about the books that I loved as a kid, and I can count them on two fingers. It was Gary Paulson's Hatchet, and it was Walter Dean Meyer's Fallen Angels. Those two books were the only books I ever enjoyed as a kid, and I didn't enjoy books through middle school, through high school. I mean, I read like the Goosebumps and stuff like that, but I didn't really dig it. And then when I was in college, Ron Rash handed me a copy of William Gay's I Hate to See That Evening Sun Go Down. And it was the first time that I'd ever read about people that I recognized and about places that I could see. I didn't realize that there were people doing that. And so that's an empowering feeling because it allows you to be seen. I think literature can work one of two ways. One is it allows you to walk in someone else's shoes, or in the way that I just described, in that it allows you to be seen. But both of them, which is what George Saunders said. He said, fiction, when it's done well, has the ability to serve as empathy's training wheels. I think that's absolutely right. All of a sudden, when you feel seen, you realize that your stories matter, and that through that you matter, and the place that you come from matters, and that your people matter, and all of those are important things. When I think about those students over there in Hayesville, there was one of them. He gave me his story, and at the time I didn't really think nothing of it, that he'd given me this. And after they'd all left, Mary Ann told me how big a deal it was that this kid didn't talk to nobody. He didn't have he was basically unreachable, and he had came from a pretty rough upbringing, and he damn sure didn't have a whole lot. He wasn't coming from any sort of privileged place at all. And he wanted to share his story with me because he knew I would get it. And I did get it, because I've known kids like him and grew up with kids like him my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think again, that's what it boils down to. He had to read Where All Light Tends to Go, and he had to read an essay that I wrote called Digging in the Trash. And when he read those things, he felt seen, and he knew that I would understand, and he entrusted me with that story. Um, that's an incredibly powerful thing. Um, I think if more of us were willing to just take the time and sit with people and listen, uh, and to have uh, the ability to hold that and not do nothing with it, like they're trusting you. And if when they hand that to you, it takes it off of them for a split second, and sometimes that's all you need is a second to catch your breath. And for that day, for him, I think that's what it was. It was a second for him to catch his breath, and that's the power of story.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned digging in the trash is a fantastic essay that you wrote, and then also your essay on gun culture
Yeah.
that was in the New York Times Magazine, I
Yep.
think what it
Yeah.
was. Yeah, and that also is fantastic. So for everybody in attendance who wants to read more, David Joy, those are two really good essays, and relates loosely to another question from the audience, and that we can also kind of tie to some other stuff that we talked about. But the question is, do you think your characters still feel left behind during President Trump's presidency? And I'll riff on that a little bit in just the current climate. We kind of started off talking about how divisive 2016 was and what you saw. And also, and I've heard you talk about this at other events, the, kind of like the bad rap that Appalachia got because of it, with things like Hillbilly Elegy and that. Do you see an evolution of that in the current moment? What's it been like, and does that affect the stories that you're creating in your head right now?
Yeah, I trying to think of how to answer that question. I think that this place right now feels equally as divisive as everywhere else in the country. And I don't think there's anything spectacular about it. Like, I don't think that it's more so here than it is in other places. And if you go back to 2016, everybody wanted to point their finger at this place. And they said that's who did this to us. That Appalachia is responsible for this presidency. And the truth is that the people who felt compelled to vote for Donald Trump in 2016 were all over this country. I mean, if you look at the electoral maps, it's the whole damn country. And if you look at, everybody always wants to point their finger at Appalachia or point their finger at the South, and then you watch these things, and it's it's in New York City. A black bird watcher is accosted, and the woman calls the police on him. Hell, she's a Democrat. She's a liberal, a Clinton voter. And they never would have put those two things together. They never would have put liberal, Clinton voting, wealthy woman in New York City, racist. Like, but they would have looked at me, and they'd have just took one look and be like, yep, he talks funny, racist as hell. And you look at these places where those people I forget where them dumbasses pulled them guns, them two old white people in that gated house. You look at that happen. Or you look, there was things that happened in Colorado, or there were things that happened in California. The truth is, all the problems that everybody wanted to say, yep, that's a Southern problem. That is the water in the basement of the American house. This country was founded on racism. When I look at the things that are happening politically, the only explanation the reason I'm talking about racism is that the only explanation I can come up with for why any of this shit has happened is white supremacy. That's the only thing that makes sense. It's votes based off of racism. It's votes based off of xenophobia. Uh, and we've reached a point in time where this ship's been taking on water for far too damn long, and nobody's done nothing. They were all sitting in their chairs, and it came to a head. And the unhopeful part of me sits around and looks at it and thinks, how the hell do we crawl ourselves? How do we crawl out of this? And then there's this oddly hopeful spot where I look at the things that happened in this country earlier in the year, and I think that wouldn't have happened 4 years ago, and it wouldn't have. You know, if you go back and you think about, well, hell, let's think about Trayvon Martin. Let's think about when Trayvon Martin was murdered, and you had all of these people trying to bring this to attention, and you had all of these people protesting. They wasn't but one group protesting that. They wasn't no white people standing with them.
Yeah.
And you jump forward to now, and the truth is we're all sick of it. And when you reach a point like that, I think that's a powerful position. And so maybe all of the things that have gone on, you know, even where I'm sitting, I'm sitting at Western Carolina University. They've got a sign. There was a black church up on a hill not too far from here, and when that church, they forced them to move I think it was in the 20s. They forced these people to tear down this church, dig up their dead out of the cemetery, and move off the mountain because they wanted to build a residence hall. And the plaque that's out there says on such and such date, the Cullowhee AME Church moved down the road. Well, they didn't move down the road; they were removed. And you have all of this racism that has existed blatantly for decades and decades and decades, and now people are paying attention to that stuff. People at this university are paying attention to that stuff. The Confederate statue that overlooks downtown Silva, it's commissioners are voting on it. If nothing else, there's discussions that are taking place that weren't taking place 4 years ago. And so the hopeful side of me thinks that maybe all of this coming to a head gets us to a place where change is inevitable. And it's got to change. Things can't continue to go the way that they've gone, for the past 250 years, for us to ever get to any sort of place where democracy is going to work, and where democracy is going to work for all of us, not just me. You done got me on a damn soapbox. But I told Ashley, and I mean this, I told her the other day, I said, where we were riding around, and I said, how has Donald Trump's presidency affected your day-to-day life over the last 4 years? And both of us said it hasn't. And the reason it hasn't is because we're very, very privileged people. You can't say that for a person. There ain't a person of color in this country who can say that and be correct about it. Their lives have changed, and their lives are continuing to change. And so for me, I think when I vote, I don't vote for me because there ain't a whole lot could happen that's going to affect me. I really honestly believe that. And so I vote for a whole lot of other reasons. And I think more and more people are, if nothing else, I mean, the problems that are ripping this country apart are so evident at this point in time that, I mean, I don't see any way you ignore it any longer.
I agree. Well, good Good stuff. Thank you for
that was a damn downer ass question.
Well, so the last thing that I wanted to finish on is another thing that I stumbled across doing some research for this, and this is your bookshop page. So for people who don't know, Bookshop is a platform that launched earlier this year. The timing was pretty impeccable. It launched like in late January, so right in time for the pandemic and online shopping. And it's a third-party platform in which small bookstores that may not have an online presence can sell books online. When you order through them, the bookstore gets a cut of the books. And it gets drop shipped directly to you from the warehouse. But it also is a platform where, authors and bloggers and stuff can create storefronts and create these lists. And I found yours. And just for anybody, I'm going to drop the link here in the chat. And if anybody sees books on here that they want, us here at Paulina Springs can get them for you. Country Bookshelf in Bozeman and Madison Books in Seattle can definitely get our hands on all these books, or if you're somewhere else and you've got a local indie there. But did you put this together yourself?
Yeah. Early on, I mean, I did that the day they launched.
You did there's some awesome books on here. And I like also your lists. So books to read instead of American Dirt and your Black Matter list are really great. And this still happens. And this is something that I'm going to rant a little bit, but the American Dirt problem, I've tried to kind of subtly, when somebody comes in really enthusiastic about that book, want it, like, oh, I've read about it, I want to read it. And I'm certainly not here to tell people what to read. Yeah. But I try to be like, hey, you could also, get this one as well, because it's written by somebody who has been through this experience or whatever. But I highly encourage people who are attending to check out this bookshop page. She's got, the Black Voices Matter list. And then one book in particular that I wanted to ask you about, because I read it recently, on your favorite books of 2020 is The Bear by Ann Rivac.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's basically
man, that's the best book. That's the best book I've read in I don't know. I mean, years. It is.
We've had multiple people come in, I'll sell it to somebody or give it to a friend, and then the next day they come in and buy like 8 copies to give to all their friends.
Man, I tell you, I know what it is too. He wrote a myth. And that don't sound like something that would be difficult to do, but think about the idea of writing a story that could last eons.
Yeah.
Like the myths that we all know. The idea of writing a story, in that capacity, that's what he did. That's the reason that book's good. I mean, that's and I tell you the other one, and I won't even try to pronounce her name, but I think it's called These Mountains Sings, or the Mountains Sing.
Mountains Sing.
Yeah, Nguyen Phan Mai is, I believe, how you pronounce it, but I'm pretty redneck to be trying to speak Vietnamese, but I believe it's Nguyen Phan Mai, The Mountains Sing. That's the other book that I read this year that just blew my mind. Both of those, which hell, now I'm just going to start naming a book. Leah Hampton's Fuck Face. That's the best short story collection that came out this year. One of the best debuts I've read this year, Annette Sanuk Clapsaddle's Even As We Breathe. That's the first novel ever written by an enrolled member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee, and it's a hell of a book. I mean, she's an incredibly talented writer. We've had a pile of good books come out this year.
Yeah, and also Jessica from Country Bookshelf also reminded me to shout out the Appalachia as depicted by Appalachians list that put on there as well.
Yeah. You know what? You know that shit ass movie came out tonight.
Was it tonight?
Yeah, it was tonight. So it's good that we was having this talk, and it's good she brought up that book list because there's you know, there's an essay that came out. Leah Hampton wrote. I can't remember the name of the venue, but Leah Hampton's the writer. If you Google search Nina Simone, Leah Hampton, Nina Simone, Appalachia, those terms, this thing will come up. Man, this is one of the best essays ever written about Appalachia, period in history. And she's the kind of voice that I'm talking about. She's the kind of voice that makes us uncomfortable and that forces us to ask difficult questions that recognize and fully realize the complexities of this place. And so for people who are wanting to try to get a better understanding of this place and this region, that list, there's a lot of good books in that list, but maybe start with that essay.
Yeah, we've got it in the chat here. Lost in a Misgendered Appalachia. Is that?
Yeah. Nina Simone and truck nuts in an essay. Well, I mean, what did you ask for?
Well, I think on that note, I think we can kind of wrap it up. If you have any last things you wanted to share.
No, but I appreciate you having me. I hope to get back out there sooner or later.
Absolutely.
I'd love to get out to Montana. So maybe one of these days I'll head out west.
Definitely. Yeah, we'll put together a whole Western book tour for you.
That'd be fun.
But yeah, thank you again. Thank you to everybody who attended. Pick up a copy of When These Mountains Burn at your local indie, and check out those book lists and essays that we talked about. And everybody have a fantastic Thanksgiving, happy holidays, and be safe, everybody. Drive safe, David. And
yeah, I'll do it.
Good night, everybody.